By the middle of 1918, the guns on the Western Front had been thundering unceasingly for almost 4 years, but neither side had been able to win a decisive victory. It was the Allies who had suffered worst during the first half of 1918. The most serious blow that had befallen the Western Allies had resulted from the Russian Revolution. This brought about Russia's formal exit from the war in March 1918 and left her in the grip of a widening civil conflict. Russia's withdrawal from the war had enabled the Germans to concentrate the bulk of their forces in the West and to deal the Allies a series of near devastating blows. These attacks had been spearheaded by specially trained stormtroops. They had found a means of breaking the stalemate of trench warfare by infiltrating their way through the Allied defenses, bypassing strongpoints. The Allies suffered a total of some 800,000 men killed, wounded, and made prisoner. They also lost almost all the small amount of territory that they had gained during their protracted and bloody offensives of 1916 and 1917. Yet the Allies had not broken, and by the middle of July they had managed to exhaust Germany's offensive capability. Furthermore, there were now 300,000 American troops in France, and more were arriving at a rate of well over 250,000 per month. The Germans had been well aware of this build-up, and it had been one of the main reasons behind their spring 1918 offensives. But now that the Germans had failed, the Allied Generalissimo, Ferdinand Foch, seen here with French Prime Minister Clemenceau, was determined to attack before they could recover. America's entry into the war in April 1917 had given the tired British and French renewed hope, but it had taken a long time for the American contribution to become effective. The Americans had regarded the outbreak of the Great War in August 1914 as a mere European squabble, which had little to do with them. True, there had been sympathy over the rape of Belgium. This had turned to anger over the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in May 1915. But this was tempered by irritation over Britain's policy of boarding US merchant vessels to ensure that they were not carrying contraband goods to the Central Powers. With the long shadow of the American Civil War lying over them, Americans considered that this new European conflict merely confirmed that war was barbarous and a debasement of humankind. The result was that strict neutrality was America's watchword, combined with efforts to try and make the warring states see reason. Thus, as late as the end of 1916, President Woodrow Wilson asked the combatants to reaffirm their war aims in the vain hope that this might make them reconsider and begin to talk peace. In the meantime, the Americans continued to develop their growing industrial might and to exploit the natural resources of their vast country. But the renewal on a much wider scale of Germany's unrestricted submarine campaign against shipping in early 1917 began to sway popular opinion, although Wilson hoped that the severing of diplomatic relations with Germany and the declaration of armed neutrality would make her think again. It was Mexico, however, which was the catalyst that drew America into the war. Relations between the two countries had deteriorated in 1916 as a result of American forces crossing the border to hunt down the Mexican bandit Pancho Villa, who had made a number of raids into Texas. In March 1917, British intelligence informed the US government that the Germans were proposing an alliance with Mexico, so that she could regain territory lost to America in the previous century. This was the last straw for Wilson, and on the 6th of April 1917, both houses of Congress met to hear the president declare war. This was much welcomed by Britain and France, but while the United States could provide much-needed cash to support their overstretched war economies, and her navy could give significant help in combating the U-boat menace in the North Sea and Atlantic, in other ways she was totally unready for war. While the arrival of the US Atlantic Fleet in European waters was of great help, it was to America's contribution on land that the British and French mainly looked. Yet, in April 1917, the standing US Army was only 110,000 men strong. Furthermore, these troops were hardly trained for the type of war being fought in Europe. They were a mere constabulary, competent enough at chasing such as Pancho Villa across the border and pacifying the Philippines, but lacking knowledge and experience of the technology and tactics of trench warfare. So ill-equipped were the American troops that early arrivals in France had to wear French helmets, although they soon adopted the British model. As for modern weapons, such as aircraft, artillery, and tanks, they had to be entirely equipped by the French and British. It was only once the Americans had arrived in France that they could begin to carry out proper training on these weapons and learn the art of trench warfare. Most of their training was carried out under French and British supervision. One essential element was gas warfare, which had become commonplace on the Western Front from 1915 onwards. Troops had to be taught to overcome the terrors of this weapon. To learn these new skills took many months, and it would thus be some time before the American presence could make itself felt on the Western Front. Even though American troops were parading in Paris on the 4th of July 1917, Independence Day, wearing what the French called le chapeau de cowboy. Not until October 1917 did American troops have their first experience, under French tutelage, of trench warfare in the Lunéville sector. This brought about their first battle casualties. General John Pershing, popularly known as Black Jack, commanded the American Expeditionary Force. A veteran of the 1898 Spanish-American War, the Philippines, and commander of the 1916 punitive expedition to Mexico, he was combat experienced by American standards. Pershing was determined to maintain the entity of the American forces in France, rather than allow them to fight piecemeal under French and British command, even during the dark days of spring 1918, when the Germans seemed to be driving all before them. He did, however, allow some of his earlier rivals to help the French in repelling the final German attacks in mid-1918. In mid-July 1918, the Allies began to mass their forces for offensive action. At the same time, Pershing ordered the formal creation of the first United States Army of 14 divisions. America was now poised to take part, in her own right, in the final offensives. The turning point on the Western Front had finally arrived. It was, too, the same on most of the other fronts. British and French forces had to be sent to Italy after the Austro-German attack at Caporetto in October 1917 had driven the Italians back 85 miles. The Allied line eventually stabilized on the River Piave and just 15 miles from Venice. The Italian army quickly restored its shattered morale. Austro-German pressure had been maintained on the River Piave during the first half of 1918, but in the latter half of October, the Allies struck across the river in such a devastating way as to split the Austrian armies, throw them back in confusion, and force them to ask for an armistice after just over 2 weeks fighting. In Salonika, in northeastern Greece, the deadlock that had existed for 3 years between the Allied forces and the Bulgarians, with a little German stiffening, was finally broken. The Allies launched a major offensive in autumn 1918. This made quick progress, and Bulgaria was soon forced to sue for peace. Elsewhere during the Great War, there were 2 long campaigns between the British and Turks. In Mesopotamia, now Iraq, Indian troops had landed at Basra in November 1914 in order to secure oil fields. An advance up the river Tigris almost as far as Baghdad was then made, but the logistic support was lacking. The British fell back to Kut el Amara, where they were besieged and forced to surrender in April 1916. A fresh commander and reorganization resulted in another advance, which relied extensively on fire support from gunboats on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In April 1917, Baghdad was finally captured. Thereafter, British forces pushed north and even reached Baku on the Caspian Sea. Further west, in early 1915, the Turks had made an abortive attack across the Suez Canal into Egypt. This was garrisoned by British and Dominion troops. They were able to repulse this attack without difficulty. At the end of April 1916, the British crossed the canal and began to advance into Sinai. A stalemate occurred in front of Gaza. Here, tanks were used for the only time in the Middle East, but the desert conditions proved too much for them. Instead, the British relied heavily on horsed cavalry. It was not until a road, water pipeline, and railway line were built across the trackless desert that the British were able to break through the Turkish defenses. In autumn 1917, the British reached Jerusalem. Hopes of a further advance were dashed by demands for reinforcements from the Middle East to help hold back the German drives on the Western Front. A period of relatively static warfare therefore followed. It was not until autumn 1918 that the offensive was resumed, thrusting north through what is now modern Israel. A weapon which proved particularly effective in the Middle East was the Rolls-Royce armoured car, which was used extensively for reconnaissance. Such was its reliability that models like this also saw active service in the North African desert over 20 years later. Turks were also facing an Arab revolt in their rear. This had been largely fomented by a British officer, T.E. Lawrence, who is seen here in Arab dress to the right of the central bearded figure. By the end of October 1918, the British had reached Aleppo. The Turkish armies had been broken and the Ottoman Empire sued for peace. In Africa, the Allies experienced little difficulty in overrunning German Southwest Africa and Cameroon in 1914, but the German colony in East Africa proved a much harder nut to crack. The war here involved not just white troops. Both sides were largely made up of black Africans, who proved to be skillful soldiers in the bush. The Germans, with relatively small forces, were able to keep the Allies at bay for 4 years, and did not lay down their arms until after the end of the war in Europe. The campaign was also marked by the high incidence of sickness, especially malaria, which caused more casualties than combat. The main drama was played out on the Western Front. The Allied plan was to keep striking and allow the Germans no respite. First came the French counter-offensive into flanks of the German salients in Champagne. Then, on the 8th of August, the British struck at Amiens. As at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, the attack was led by tanks, 440 in number. While still slow, with a top speed of no more than 4.6 miles per hour, and mechanically unreliable, they did help to achieve a breakthrough. Before the end of the 8th of August, Australian and Canadian troops had penetrated 9 miles. Their casualties were remarkably light, just over 4,000 killed, wounded and missing. It was the furthest that any Allied attack on the Western Front had progressed in one day, and with the least casualties for a first day. On the second day, with only 145 tanks still fit, the advance made a further 3 miles. Thereafter, few tanks were available, and the attack came to a halt. Even so, Erich von Ludendorff, the German Chief of Staff, called the 8th of August the Black Day for the German army. The 30,000 prisoners captured indicated only too clearly that its cohesion was now being brought into question. In mid-September, it was the turn of the Americans, who successfully eradicated the Saint-Mihiel salient east of Verdun. This was their first independent operation. Eight American and 3 French divisions, supported by 144 tanks, mostly American manned, and 2,800 guns, took part. Attacking on a 25-mile front, the Americans achieved their objective in 4 days. Their sheer enthusiasm more than made up for their lack of experience. Then the Belgians and British attacked out of the Ypres salient. For the Belgians in particular, this was very welcome. For 4 long years they had been clinging on to one small remnant of their country. Now, finally, they could begin the business of liberating the remainder of it. the 26th of September, the French and Americans struck in the broken and hilly Argonne. No less than 600,000 men had been concentrated on a 40-mile wide front. They were supported by nearly 500 tanks and some 3,000 guns. On the first day, good progress was made. From then on, as the attackers entered the wooded hills and German resistance stiffened, the fighting became tougher and coordination between units was increasingly more difficult. Tanks could not operate in this broken terrain, and the attackers had to rely on their artillery to get them forward. Well-prepared German positions and numerous counterattacks intensified the bitterness of the fighting. The fighting saw specialist trench weapons come to the fore once more. Examples were this French grenade thrower and a bomb launcher. The French, with their greater experience, found it easier to cope in these difficult conditions than Americans. A growing problem was that there were only 3 roads leading into the battle area. These soon became congested and meant that reserves could not be deployed in time. Consequently, on the 30th of September, the offensive was halted. The torch was now passed to the British, who had begun to attack the formidable Hindenburg line on the 27th of September. Supported by massive artillery, the Canadian Corps fired no less than 7,000 tons of shells in one day. A breach 12 miles wide and 6 miles deep was created in the German defences. After 4 days' fighting, there was a short pause for regrouping. Then, on the 5th of October, the Hindenburg line was finally broken, with the capture of 36,000 prisoners and 380 guns. It seemed, at least as far as the British were concerned, that they had now picked the lock on which the German defence was founded. Now the British could begin to advance away from the trenches that had so dominated their lives during the past 4 years into the open country beyond. Thus mobile warfare came once more to the Western Front. But could the Allies sustain it and bring about the ultimate defeat of the German armies in the West? As the Allied troops advanced into open country in October 1918, they found that new tactics were needed to wage this more mobile warfare. The Germans too fought with skill. They relied on rearguards, supported by artillery and heavily armed with machine guns, to prevent the Allies from closing with their main body. These ensured that the Allies paid a heavy price in casualties for the ground they gained. Nevertheless, the Allies pushed remorselessly forward. But while the German ability to fight was seemingly unimpaired, behind the front there were growing doubts as to Germany's ability to continue the war. The Allied blockade had been very tight for a long time and had brought Germany's maritime trade to a standstill. Food was becoming desperately short. Inevitably, civilians suffered worst. But even frontline troops were now subsisting on black bread, coffee made of acorns, bad potatoes, and horse meat. Germany was also beginning to run out of manpower, with 17 and even 16-year-olds being conscripted. By early October, even Ludendorff accepted that the war was lost. Faced with ever-mounting losses, he recommended an immediate withdrawal to Germany's 1914 western border, and that an approach should be made to the Allies for an armistice. This approach was to be made on the basis of a declaration made by President Wilson in January 1918 and agreed by his allies on conditions for peace. They were known as the 14 points. Germany and America exchanged diplomatic notes, but on the 16th of October, Wilson suddenly backtracked. He had not kept his allies properly informed, and they now insisted that it was up to the military commanders to lay down armistice terms. The generals demanded that these must make it impossible for Germany to renew hostilities. This implied surrender, and threw Berlin, which had been hoping for peace with honor, into confusion. Meanwhile, the Allied offensive on the Western Front ground on remorselessly, the troops on both sides being unaware of the high-level armistice negotiations. Indeed, most on the Allied side remained certain that the war would drag on through the winter. The German rearguards continued to offer fierce resistance, and Allied casualties were heavy. As the Germans were forced back, they adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying everything in their wake. The Allied armies had to expend considerable resources on repairing roads and railways, so that the momentum of their attacks could be maintained. For the former inhabitants of the recently liberated towns and villages, the joy of returning home was often tempered by shock at the destruction. Ludendorff was right in his fears that cracks were appearing in Germany's military machine. Army units in the rear areas began to elect soldiers' councils on Russian Bolshevik lines and jeered at their comrades who continued to fight on. The High Seas Fleet mutinied when ordered to sea. Germany's allies began to throw in the towel. Bulgaria had already signed an armistice at the end of September. Turkey did so on the 30th of October, and then Austro-Hungary on the 4th of November. The German government, isolated and under intense pressure from below, finally accepted that the armistice had to be on Allied terms. Ludendorff disagreed, was sacked, and an armistice delegation was sent through the front lines. 2 days later, under pressure from von Hindenburg, the Kaiser abdicated. He went into immediate exile in neutral Holland, where he was to spend the remainder of his days. Germany was now a republic with an uncertain future. While the guns continued to thunder, a railway train pulled into the forest of Compiègne. In one of its carriages at 5 o'clock in the morning of the 11th of November, the German delegation signed the armistice agreement. Six hours later, the guns ceased their angry rumbling, and France and Flanders experienced a stillness which they had not known for over 4 years. In Paris, London, and New York, the news brought the crowds out on the streets in hysterical jubilation, which would last on through the night. At the front itself, the ceasefire was greeted by the troops not so much with joy, but relief that they had survived, tinged with sadness for the 9 million who had not. No sooner had the armistice on the Western Front come into effect on the 11th of November 1918 than the German forces began their march back into Germany. Most German frontline soldiers, while glad that the fighting was over, did not feel that they had been defeated on the field of battle. They noted that the armistice delegation had been all civilian, and there was a sense of betrayal. It was this which would later generate the stab-in-the-back notion propagated by right-wing politicians. The Allied armies duly followed up a day or two's march behind the withdrawing Germans. Liberated towns and villages greeted them with wild enthusiasm. The French moved quickly to bring Alsace and Lorraine, lost to Germany in 1870, back into the fold. The citizens of Brussels were overjoyed to be reunited with their king. The Allies now crossed the Rhine and occupied bridgeheads beyond it. Their military bands met with little response from the sullen German population in this region. The German High Seas Fleet sailed into the British base at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys to surrender. The ships were impounded, but the Germans were to have the last laugh. A short time later, their crews scuttled them. 13 capital ships and 58 lesser warships sank to the bottom. Germany, meanwhile, was in turmoil. The democratic government had been set up at the beginning of November, but this came under threat from the hard left, which was represented by soldiers and workers' councils set up on Bolshevik lines. There were also the even more extreme Spartacists, followers of Lenin, who were bent on installing a communist regime. The government itself tried to steer a middle course, forming its own military units to protect it rather than be seen to be supported by the army of the old order. It also promised new elections. Matters came to a head at the beginning of January 1919, after clashes with government troops just before Christmas. The Spartacists declared that the government was no more and called a general strike. By this stage, though, a number of German army officers returning from the front with their troops had become so concerned by the growing anarchy that they formed volunteer units known as Freikorps. It was to these that the government was forced to turn, and they quickly moved into Berlin and crushed the Spartacists with much severity. Thousands were arrested, and there were many deaths. Among the victims were the two Spartacist leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The government held the promised elections and won them, but left-wing unrest continued, culminating in a general strike. Once again, the Freikorps moved into Berlin, and in the space of 10 days crushed the left, forcing the German communists to go underground. Nevertheless, the government, concerned over its own safety, had moved to Weimar, 150 miles south of Berlin. Matters went even further in Munich. The hard left actually took over the Bavarian state government and began brutally to purge political opponents. It was the Freikorps once more who had to restore order. Advancing swiftly on Munich, they crushed the revolution with much ferocity, killing no less than 1,000 people in the space of a week, and restored democratic government. Similar political upheavals elsewhere in Central Europe were redrawing the map. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl, who had succeeded Franz Joseph in 1916, abdicated. Hungary immediately broke away, and in February 1919, the recently installed democratic government was overthrown by Bela Kun, who had been indoctrinated into communism while a prisoner of war of the Russians. In turn, there was a successful right-wing counter-coup led by Admiral Miklos Horthy, seen here in the center. But the victorious Allies also had their problems. Instability in Italy soon led to the rise of Mussolini and his fascists. Britain was rocked by a series of industrial strikes, which so concerned the government that the crack Guards division was brought home from France and paraded through London streets as a warning to troublemakers. In North America, too, there was much industrial unrest and violence, largely caused by an organization called the Industrial Workers of the World, more commonly known as the Wobblies. Much of the inspiration for this unrest came from Russia, but here the civil war had grown ever more widespread until it engulfed the country. At base, it was the determination of the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, to consolidate their revolution in the face of the Whites, those opposed to what it stood for. Not until the whole of their vast country had been brought under control could the Bolsheviks feel secure. There was, however, no Tsar to put back on the throne, since he and his family had been executed by the Reds in July 1918. In spring 1919, three white armies began to converge on the Red Heartland, based on Petrograd and Moscow in western Russia. One advanced west from Siberia. Another moved north from the Ukraine, while a third struck from Russia's western border. Dominating the campaign in the eastern part of the country was the Trans-Siberian Railway, which ran from Moscow to Vladivostok. Fierce battles were fought along its length for control of it. Another aspect of the war was the part played by the wartime Allies. Initially, they had sent small contingents to Russia in the vain hope that she might continue to fight on against the Germans. After Russia's exit from the war, the Western Allies, fearing a spread of communism, and Japan, keen to extend her sphere of influence, began to give active support to the Whites. Japanese, American, and British ground and naval forces were deployed to Vladivostok. British and French elements were in the Ukraine and Caucasus, and British, French, Canadian, American, Italian, and even Serbian forces in the extreme north, around the ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The main role of the Allied contingents was to arm, equip, and to advise the White forces. But often they found themselves in direct combat with the Reds. With all this support, the Whites should have overcome Bolshevism with comparative ease, but this was not so. The White commanders were generally inept, and there was little cooperation among them. Many of their soldiers proved to be ill-disciplined and unreliable. The Reds, on the other hand, had as their military leader Leon Trotsky, who showed himself to be a natural organizer and an inspiration to his soldiers. One of his outstanding commanders was Semyon Budyeni, well known for his luxuriant moustache. A former Tsarist trooper, he rose to command the first Red Cavalry Army, which he led with particular dash. For almost 2 years, the fighting swept back and forth across Russia as the Reds dealt with each White advance in turn. By early 1920, the Whites had everywhere been defeated. The Allies had seen the writing on the wall well before then, and had faced increasing domestic questioning over their role in Russia. Consequently, they withdrew their support for the Whites and sailed home. The main victims of the Russian Civil War were the ordinary people. They were subjected to barbarities by both Reds and Whites. The war also totally disrupted industry and agriculture. This resulted in widespread famine and disease. No one knows how many perished, but it certainly ran to several millions. In January 1919, representatives of the Allied nations met in Paris and began to decide on the peace terms. While all agreed with United States President Wilson's 14 points as principles for avoiding future wars, there was initially much divergence in views as to the degree to which the defeated nations, who were seen as the original aggressors, should be punished. France could not forget the 1.5 million dead she had suffered, and the devastation in the northern part of her land. Consequently, her Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, known as the Tiger, was especially keen to make Germany pay for the damage she had caused. British Prime Minister Lloyd George was conscious of the 1 million British Empire dead and massive financial debt to America. Wilson took a softer line, but was undermined by Congress, which now wanted to disengage from Europe as soon as possible. Of the other victorious powers, Italy and Japan were soon to be disappointed by their territorial awards, even though Germany lost all her overseas colonies. The Ottoman Empire was also broken up, with France being awarded the mandates of Syria and Lebanon, and Britain those of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Within Eastern Europe, President Wilson's principle of self-determination, one of the 14 points, exerted a large influence in what was to be a dramatic redrawing of the map. 3 independent Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, were created, and Poland gained her independence. She was awarded the whole of Galicia, and, more significant for the future, a corridor to the Baltic in the Danzig area, thus isolating the German territory of East Prussia. The remainder of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire was entirely broken up, with Austria becoming a small republic and Hungarian independence being recognized. A new state of Czechoslovakia, which contained a significant ethnic German minority, was created. Substantial changes also took place in the Balkans. Serbia, Montenegro, and the former Austrian provinces of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina combined to form the state of Yugoslavia. The Serbs were to be dominant, but other ethnic groupings did not object, since they were now members of a victor state. The armed forces of the conquered nations were severely restricted. Germany was allowed an all-volunteer army of just 100,000 men. Her air force, her few tanks, mostly captured British models, and large guns were to be destroyed, and her vast munitions industry dismantled. She also had to pay the Allies huge financial reparations. A strong body of opinion in Germany was in favor of rejecting the peace terms as being unbelievably harsh, arguing that her armies had not been defeated in the field. Indeed, some troops had been allowed to parade in Berlin with their weapons at the end of 1918. In truth, though, there was no option, and on the 28th of June 1919, the delegates assembled to sign the peace in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the very room in which Kaiser Wilhelm I had been proclaimed Emperor of all Germany in 1871. Peace treaties were subsequently signed with the other defeated states. The Allies celebrated the Treaty of Versailles with victory parades in New York, Paris, London, and elsewhere. Now the Allies could turn to the business of dismantling their war machines and winning the peace, confident that they had taken the necessary steps to ensure that there would be no more major conflicts in Europe. Numerous war cemeteries and memorials to the war dead sprang up. These, together with the hundreds of thousands who had been mentally and physically mutilated during 1914-18, acted as a stark reminder of the horrors of war. The Paris Peace Conference had, however, drawn up another way of ensuring that major conflict did not break out in the future. The establishment of the League of Nations was once again the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson. All victorious nations and neutral states were invited to join, and 42 did so. It aimed to prevent potential conflict by arbitration. If this failed, and one member did attack another, the League could impose sanctions, and as a last resort, force. Yet even as the League convened for the first time at its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland in November 1920, it was faced with problems. For a start, the US Senate had refused to ratify it. Worse, Wilson lost the presidential election in that same month, November. This meant that America did not join. But there was already trouble in Eastern Europe. Poland and Lithuania invaded Ukraine in August 1919. The Russians struck back, but eventually, a year later, were defeated, leaving part of the Ukraine in Polish hands. There was trouble too with Turkey. The Allies had insisted that she surrender the extreme western part of Asia Minor to Greece. Allied troops were landed in the Dardanelles to enforce this. While the Sultan of Turkey was prepared to accept it, some of his generals were not. They overthrew him in early 1921 and attacked the Greeks, driving them back in disarray. The British troops at Chanak, at the western end of the Dardanelles Straits, prepared to intercede in what seemed about to become a third Balkan War. Eventually, though, the Allies dropped their demands on the Turkish mainland, and a revised peace treaty was signed in 1923. Europe breathed again. In November 1918, the victorious nations believed that they had just won the war to end all war. But even as the apparatus for maintaining peace in the future was being set up, new forces were stirring. Forces that would eventually engulf whole populations and threaten the stability of the world.